Welcome to Biblioccultist, where I review books that I find interesting in the topics of religion, philosophy, history, and fiction. In this episode, I'm going to go over Genesis, Creation, and Early Man by Father Seraphim Rose. But before I begin, please remember to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. It really helps the channel to grow, and I really appreciate it. So Genesis, Creation, and Early Man, the Orthodox Christian Vision is the full title. It is by Father Seraphim Rose. The edition that I have here is from St. Hermit of Alaska Press, and it was published in the year 2000. Now, this work basically presents the Orthodox Christian tradition regarding Genesis, and it attempts to basically answer modern concerns and questions on these topics, and it's divided into the main section, which goes through Genesis and collects not only the opinions and comments of the early church fathers on these verses, but also the opinion of Father Seraphim Rose on the topic. And he basically integrates that ancient information with modern concepts like evolution and scientism, etc. So he's trying to take this information and make it digestible for a modern audience. Further down, there is a piece of the work that goes specifically into evolution and his critiques of it, and then you have a Q&A at the end that is very good as well, and it goes deeper into the topic. Now, being a modern work, it obviously addresses socialism, globalism, scientism, and just how materialism in general is incompatible with traditional Orthodox Christianity. So it does offer a critique of these concepts that are fairly prevalent in the modern world from the Orthodox point of view, and he's arguing that the key to critiquing these positions can be found primarily in the first few books of the Old Testament and the Christian understanding of these texts, because it stems from the argument that the modern world is relativistic and materialistic. So once you accept the premises in Genesis and understand them correctly, then you almost have a natural immunity to them. And therefore, this book is very interesting just for that fact alone, for that conception. Now, one thing I found very important is that he talks about how Prophet Moses, who is supposed to be the author of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch, the Prophet Moses possessed divine theoria, or theoria, which is basically a vision that God provides to the prophet, a vision of eternal truths. His argument is that this divine theoria was also shared by the church fathers. Therefore, not only do we get the divine vision of Prophet Moses when he wrote the book, but for us to understand it, we need other interpreters, and those interpreters will be the church through the church fathers, who also have divine theoria. And because they also have a vision from God of absolute truth, then we can understand this book only through their vision, because we don't possess said vision. So this is the pivot of why an Orthodox Christian takes the books of Genesis seriously, and why the only way to interpret them has to be through other divinely inspired sources, which would be the church tradition. Because traditional Christianity was not only about a book, which is a very modern conception of Christianity stemming from the Protestant Revolution, the whole sola scriptura idea, but actually stems from a combination of the book, which itself is a product of tradition, and the tradition itself. The Bible doesn't critique tradition, it critiques bad traditions, meaning it critiques traditions of men in contrast with traditions of God and His church. A lot of things in the Old Testament depend on tradition, including the very reading of the text, because for us to be able to understand what has a vowel, for example, and how a certain word should be understood was based on tradition. There was no other way of understanding a text. And the Bible itself, as we know it together, which is a compilation of books, stems from a tradition that put it together. deciding which books are canonical and which are not. It's not only a decision from a council of church fathers, but it's also a decision based on tradition. These books have always been accepted as part of the text, etc. Without tradition, you don't have the Bible. Therefore, tradition is the only way you can interpret said Bible. And this principle applies to all texts in general. When the Supreme Court tries to understand a law or a constitutional amendment or provision from the Constitution itself, it goes back to the men that put it together, their conversations, their intent, and that is called tradition. It's going to an external source of information to understand how the people that put that text together saw the text and understood the text. And based on that, they apply that interpretation if they are originalists and they want to understand it that way. If they're progressives, they tend to not care what the founder said and they'll just make their own interpretation. So that situation is there, and obviously that's how you see in Christianity the same. Those that believe in sola scriptura and believe that traditions don't matter and that you should just read the text and understand it for yourself, they're basically progressivists. And they're just taking their own interpretation and ignoring tradition. Those that are more conservative and traditional understand that if you want to understand the text, you want to understand those who put it together and how they understood the text. And this book goes into the intention of the church fathers and their interpretation of the books of the Bible that they canonized. Now, Father Rose does go into several possible inconsistencies in the evolutionary theory, and he does this throughout the work, but he also does it in a huge chapter midway through the end of the book, in which he goes into the different inconsistencies that he identifies in the neo-evolutionary theory. I won't go into them because you can read them, and to me that's not the most interesting aspect of the work. To me, the theological points are actually a lot more interesting, but they're very good to read and to consider. He's basically deconstructing the deconstructors, and just for that reason, it is a very cool section. Now, Father Rose is making a point that the church fathers did believe in Genesis literally. He is concerned with the modern tendency to try to understand everything allegorically. And he's making the point that the church fathers understood Genesis literally, although they also had a symbolic and mystical vision of it, but that we shouldn't forget that they also saw it as it is presented, and therefore that Orthodox Christians should see it that way as well. Now, when it comes to the dynamics of how Genesis interacts with the nature of man and the interpretations themselves, you have to read the book. I'm just going to give a few points that I do think stand out and can give you some guidance to understand the perspective and maybe entice you to read the book. So he makes it a point that the Father commands creation, but it is the Son who creates, and it is the Spirit who moves it all. Obviously, the Orthodox are Trinitarians, so Trinitarian theology is deep within the work because the Church Fathers were Trinitarians, and therefore their interpretation is in that mood. Another interesting viewpoint is that before the fall, all humans and animals were vegetarian. And I've always found that particular viewpoint interesting because certain animals will literally die if they become vegetarian. So if you have an animal that is a carnivore, he must kill to eat. But the Orthodox interpretation is that every single animal was basically a vegetarian because there was no killing before the fall of man. There was no death. Now, I don't remember reading any church father specifically addressing this point. Maybe it is out there, I just haven't seen it. And if you know of a source that actually explains this particularity, put it in the comments. I would really appreciate it. Now, another thing that I find interesting is the quote from St. Gregory of Nyssa, which argues that reincarnation is antithetical to a biblical point of view and critiques it because he argues that transmigration of souls implies a shared nature between all beings. Because this is why you can hop between species and different animals, because you have a shared nature. Whereas the Christian point of view is that natures are not shared, they're not in common, and on top of that, they're not shared with God. Not fully. Therefore, it is impossible for my particular nature to become the nature of another being because they're different. Whereas in a traditional Oriental point of view, like the Sanatana Dharma or Buddhism, etc., all beings share one single nature, and that nature is divine as well. But because all nature and substance is shared in common, doesn't mean they're the same, it just means that they have a common ontology. Then reincarnation is possible. That philosophical point of view I found to be very important, and it is a crucial element of the viewpoint in Orthodox Christianity that if it's overlooked, it can create a lot of confusion. Their argument is, if we all share a single nature, then everything is relative. So for things to be objective and secure in their particularity, then natures cannot be shared. Very interesting. Now, another section that I found good to present here is that he quotes St. John Chrysostom regarding the creation of man, that when God creates, he uses the term, "let there be light." But when he creates man, he says, "let us make." And the argument is that in that plural, which is always controversial, it's used usually to justify the Trinity. Whereas Unitarians argue that it is a plural of majesty, that the text is using a plural because it's talking about a king. But St. John Chrysostom is making the point that that plural involves dialogue, discussion. It's an inter-Trinitarian dynamic that is being expressed because in the creation of man, there is an additional element. It's not only a let there be. Now it becomes an issue of a higher being being generated. And therefore, there is a level of exchange and discussion. And just that notion itself is very interesting. Now, the work also goes into the notion that free will is what makes us in the likeness of God. And that is very important because free will in a lot of modern Christian denominations is highly disregarded in favor of predestination. But the Church Fathers were very clear that what makes us partly divine is our free will, because we share that with God himself. So man is made of matter, of earth, and is part beast, but is also part divine. We share divinity with the Trinity, and that sharing is what makes us special, and free will is a key component. The moment you diminish this, then you are really affecting the very nature of humanity, and you're affecting what it means to be human. So the passions don't have a real nature, basically. Only the virtues are real, and this is something consistent throughout the entire work, that modern Christians do believe that evil is there, and even medieval Christians in the West see evil and the passions as having a real existence, whereas traditional church fathers did not see it that way. The man is still good. That man didn't lose his nature by the fall. He was affected by the fall, but it didn't deprave man, which obviously goes against the Protestant notion of total depravity, and also the necessity of absolute grace, or the heavy emphasis on grace to be saved. The Church Fathers seem to be a little bit more balanced on this topic. Grace is a necessity in some level, but human nature is not destroyed. It is still good. And this is why the Orthodox Church does not believe in the idea of original sin in the Augustinian fashion, that we inherit a culpability. We inherit a concupiscence, a tendency towards the passions and temptations, etc. But we don't inherit a guilt that must be paid back, which is the core of all Western theological conceptions of salvation. And this point is crucial to understand if you want to understand Orthodox theology. Another quick point that I found particular is that paradise is a location on earth, but a separate section where only Adam is located, and animals and other beings are outside of paradise on earth, but not within paradise. So Adam is Lord of the planet, but he lives in a particular realm within, which is paradise itself. And nothing can hurt Adam. He is an immortal, and he is pure knowledge and pure power, which again, sometimes is a little different than how people envision it. They see usually Adam and Eve as absolute primitives and innocent, and not as lords. But the traditional church viewpoint is that Adam and Eve were a king and a queen in a way, with all the power and majesty that comes with it. To Father Rose, all modern problems are the result of man's desire to bypass the punishment that stems from the fall from paradise. So technology being used to bypass the necessity of hard work, or technology being used to bypass the pain of labor for women, etc. That our attempt is to somehow trick the system, to somehow bypass God's law so that we can have a different life, a paradise on earth. And this viewpoint of utopianism is heavily criticized by the Church Fathers and by Father Seraphim Rose in particular, as being a perversion of the necessity to live a natural life as God intended, and therefore that all ills in society stem from this perverted inclination towards improving the world that we live in to the point of making a paradise on earth. Which is interesting because also in the Vedic literature, the attempt to make earth perfect is considered to be a karmic disaster because you're denying reality. In other words, the material world cannot be made perfect. It is impossible, and therefore your attempt to do it is itself a karmic punishment, and you will be stuck forever in a cycle of life and death for it. There's a level of acceptance that is needed, of sober acceptance, of sobriety in the face of illness and death and trouble, that if we try to bypass it, we only suffer the consequences of not maturing and not facing the world as it is. Now, I have a quote here that I want to read, and it's from Saint Cyril of Alexandria. "By death, the giver of the law stopped the spread of sin, and in the very chastisement reveals his love for mankind. Inasmuch as he is giving the commandment, joined death to the transgression of it, and inasmuch as the criminal thus fell under the chastisement, so he arranged that the chastisement itself might serve for salvation. For death dissolves this animal nature of ours, and thus, on the other hand, stops the activity of evil, and on the other, delivers a man from illnesses, frees him from labors, puts an end to his sorrows and cares, and stops his bodily sufferings. With such a love for mankind has the judge mixed the chastisement." As you can see, not only bypassing the result of the fall, but even death becomes a positive to protect us from the consequences of the fall, to stop sin from spreading. And in a way, it is a mercy from God. And that point of view is very interesting and is highly valuable to consider and meditate upon. Another thing I found curious is about Enoch and Elijah, because as you probably know, Enoch and Elijah are considered to be immortals. They were taken physically from earth. The church fathers saw them in paradise, waiting to return at the end of days. And of course, that puts paradise still somewhere on earth, maybe in a separate dimension where technically you could visit, and where there are living beings in there waiting to return. Mortals that are simply being preserved in this location. And just that mystical conception is very, very cool. So I want to close with another quote that I think really gives you a perspective on the work, and then with that, I think you have enough information in regards to the work. It's from Saint Maximus the Confessor. "The mind of Adam at first was not impressed by the imagination, which stands between the mind and the thoughts, setting up a wall around the mind and not allowing it to enter into the most simple and imageless essences. of created beings. Now, the reason I wanted to close with that quote is because I would say that's the only point in this work with which I have an issue. The argument is that imagination is unnatural or somehow problematic for human beings because it stands in this kind of in between from divine reality and material reality. But I would argue that imagination is the highest aspect of mankind. And as a matter of fact, I would argue that if you're cynical about it, you can make the case that the entire interpretive lens utilized in this book through the tradition is primarily stemming from imagination. I don't mean to say that it is false. What I'm saying is that there is a level of creativity and imagination in any hermeneutical approach that you do with any particular work. I don't think you could in any way interpret any work without some level of imagination. In other words, where's the line between imagination and divine vision? And that line to me is a very difficult one to find, where you can draw it. Where is that point? So I would argue that imagination is crucial. Now, of course, you can take imagination to a point in which it becomes just myth and even to levels of mental illness that are serious, of course. But to just argue that imagination itself is perverse or in some way a reflection of the fall, I think is questionable. But of course, I could be wrong, and I'm again open to the discussion. If anybody knows of a work that specifically addresses this idea of the imagination as a consequence of a degradation of the soul or some kind of fall, I would be very interested in reading it. But nonetheless, the book is spectacular because it does give you a lot of information on traditional way of looking at Genesis and gives you a lot of particular approaches to the text. And I think that in itself is valuable, even if you're not a Christian, but you're still interested in the topic. I think you will derive a lot of benefit from the work. So please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the bell for notifications, like the video, share the video, and comment on the video. And I'll be more than happy to engage with you there. Thank you for being with me. See you next time.